In this video, we're going to talk about how to design this large Yamadori Sabina juniper from Spain. We're going to be covering the repotting process, how to get the tree into a good state of health, the cleaning process, branch selection, and then the actual design process with this tree. So this tree was collected in the mainland about 4 years ago, and last year we took it out of its original container. After it was collected, it was slip potted into that container. Now, when you're working with Sabina, it's a bit different than a lot of other Yamadori species, particularly conifers. Most of the time with most conifers, we do not bare root the trees because it can kill the plant. But with Sabina juniper, to make sure that we get all of the bacteria, all of the fungus out of the root system, we have to bare root the tree completely within 1 to 2 years after collection. So last year, that's exactly what we did. We popped it out of the original container, took all of the soil out, working it out very carefully with root rakes and chopsticks to begin with, and then we took the hose and actually blasted every little last bit of soil out of the root system. We then potted it in this wooden box to allow for a lot of aeration to the root system, and we used a nice free draining soil mix. And over the course of this last year, at Bonsai Sense here in Majorca, this tree has been heavily fertilized and allowed to grow completely unimpeded, meaning that we didn't prune any of the foliage from last year. There are a couple of very specific reasons why we did not prune the foliage. Number one, there is a hormone that's contained in all of the foliage tips out here. It's called auxin. It's a growth hormone. So if we prune the foliage, what ends up happening is you remove that growth hormone. Now, by leaving the foliage alone, that growth hormone will be transported back down to the roots and help produce better rootage. It interacts with another hormone in the root system called cytokinin that comes back up into the foliage and produces better top growth. So the moral of the story here is if you have a tree that's somewhat weak and you're trying to pump up that tree, don't prune any of the top growth. That will allow you to get better root growth and then subsequently better top growth out of the tree. So over the course of last year, this tree was fertilized using standard fertilizer cakes. It was a well-balanced NPK of 3.5, 3.5, 3.5. And with this particular species of juniper, they don't like a high nitrogen fertilizer. So we use just a standard well-balanced fertilizer. The phosphorus, which is the second number in that NPK ratio, provides a lot of nutrients for root building. So we wanted to make sure that we were utilizing something that had a decent amount of phosphorus in it as well. And then to supplement on top of that, every week, this tree had liquid seaweed applied to it, which provides a lot of micronutrients to help build up the health of the tree as well. So the combination of not pruning the tree last year and fertilizing in that manner brought the tree to the state of health that you see it in today. So you might be wondering why the tree has this slightly odd color at this stage. This is what's referred to as shimoyake in Japanese, which is basically frost burn on the tree. So when you have relatively warm days and cold nights, with junipers, you'll quite often get this coloration. It'll either be kind of a brownish color or sometimes a purplish color. It's not that big a deal. It's not necessarily affecting the health of the tree. This is just a winter coloration. So before we make any decisions about the design of this tree, we need to go through and clean up the live vein. That's going to dictate potentially what the front of the tree is going to be and what the angle of the tree is going to be. So this has aesthetic implications, but it also has health implications as well. What I mean by that is there are likely a lot of bugs and potential other pests and diseases below the bark on this tree, on the live vein. So we want to clean off all of the flaky bark that's existing on the live vein right now to expose those things and potentially kill those off using a pesticide if necessary. And then of course that's going to allow us to see the difference between the live vein and the deadwood as well, which has aesthetic implications. So that's going to be the first step when you're working with a large Yamadori like this, if it's a juniper. Now, of course, if it's a pine, you don't want to be breaking the bark off because the value in the aesthetics of those species is in the flakiness of the bark. Whereas junipers, it's in the contrast between the deadwood and the live wood. So that's going to be the very first step that we do before we make any decisions about the design. So we're about halfway through the cleaning process right now, but we're having trouble accessing certain areas of the trunk due to the foliage. So we want to assess the foliage to some degree now and remove what we don't need so that we can actually get to those areas. So this branch right here in particular, we had talked about potentially trying to use it as a rear branch on the tree, but I don't think it's going to be necessary, at least not all of the foliage. So we're going to reduce this down somewhere into this area here so we have better access to the trunk down in this area. And then that's still gives us the option to use whatever's left for rear growth if we do in fact need it, but we'll reassess that once we get through the full cleaning process. So at this stage in the process, as you can see, we've finished delineating the live vein from the dead wood. So if you notice here, all of this red section right through here, this is the live vein. It actually starts right here at the base with the roots, works its way up, twists all through here, comes up to this area, and then goes all the way back down and feeds the foliage over here. So there are a few specialty tools that we use to do this process, to delineate between the live vein and the dead wood, so I'm going to show you what those are very quickly. So first and foremost, these scraping tools right here are great for removing dead bark on already dead portions of the tree. Quite often that bark is highly dried out and very difficult to remove by any other method. So having these kind of scraping tools allows you to get into the various nooks and crannies of the trunk and really remove all of that old bark and start to delineate the two. Another really good tool to have would be this specialty knife here, which is a curved knife. Now, technically you don't need to necessarily have a curved knife. You could use a box cutter, for example, or just a standard knife. But having a curved knife like this, again, allows you to get into those small nooks and crannies of the trunk and really delineate between the live vein and the dead wood. And the final tool that we used as part of this process was a Dremel tool like this. We changed out the heads with various different heads depending on which part of the trunk we were working on. But for a majority of the cleaning, we used just a simple head like this. It doesn't damage the bark, it doesn't damage the dead tissue or the live tissue. It's relatively soft, but it does remove unnecessary blemishes and really smooth up all of the wood. So this is a great tool to have as well. So the next step is going to be to burn the areas of the dead wood that we scraped away with that initial scraping tool. A lot of those areas look somewhat contrived and man-made. So we're going to be using a little mini blowtorch like this. You can use a creme brulee flamer. You can buy a larger blowtorch if it's a large section of dead wood, but for the most part you want to use these smaller blowtorches. It gives you that sort of pinpoint accuracy so you're not burning portions of the live wood or damaging the foliage with the flame. So this is a great tool to have. The next step is going to be to use this to really char a lot of those areas of the dead wood that we just created. So now that we've burned it, cleaned up the burned areas, taken care of all of that, the next step is going to be to apply lime sulfur. Now we're using lime sulfur in a 50-50 ratio with water, so 50% water, 50% lime sulfur, and we're going to be painting it over all of the deadwood. The only issue is all the areas that we just burned, because they're still charred black, it's going to be a little bit of a grayish color, and some of that blackness might actually come through the lime sulfur as well. So it's not necessarily going to be a consistent white color all the way through, but in the future with subsequent applications of lime sulfur, that should turn a nice bright white color. Okay, now that we've painted up the lime sulfur, while that's drying, we're going to start cleaning up the foliage. So what that means is on a juniper like this, we're going to clean out the crotch growth so we can see the structure. We're also going to clean the undersides of all the branches. We're going to look for any heavy upward growth as well, and of course any long leggy growth that we can't utilize in the design. At this stage, we're not making decisions about the design quite yet. We're just cleaning out the foliage to see the structure before we get into the design process. Now that we've cleaned the tree, we've cleaned the deadwood, delineated between the live wood and the deadwood, cleaned all the foliage, the next step in the process is to figure out exactly what we want to do in terms of the design of the tree. So we really have two options, this side and the exact opposite side. So I want to talk about this side first, and then we'll look at the merits and demerits of the opposite side of the tree. So first and foremost, when you're working with a collected Yamadori juniper like this, really it's best if you can show off the live vein touching the soil, entering into the soil, which we can actually see along the backside right here. So if you notice here, this is actually the only live vein touching the soil that feeds all of this foliage up here. And then we have a separate little live vein down below here feeding that foliage on the backside. So the fact that we can see this entering the soil here is a merit for using this side of the tree. Now another interesting part of this side of the tree, of course, is you see the movement of that live vein up through here. It twists around in this area, comes up all the way up to the top here, and then comes back down on itself out into this area and feeds the foliage. So that's great to see that. Another interesting thing about this side of the tree, obviously, is the interest in the deadwood here, but this gin right here is a little bit straight. So if we did use this side of the tree, maybe we would want to remedy that by moving it. Maybe we could burn it to move it into place, or even shorten it a little bit to make it more interesting. And then up here at the top, there aren't a whole lot of striations in this area. This is one area where the original live vein actually came all the way up into this area. So when we cleaned that away, we ended up with a very flat area of deadwood, and it doesn't really have that much interest to it. So that's one demerit of this side of the tree. You'll notice here too that all of the foliage is on the back side of the plant. That's really not that big a deal. If we wanted to use this side of the tree as the front, we could flip and manipulate this foliage forward to build nice big pads in here, maybe an apex up in this area right here. So before we flip the tree to the other side, let's cover those merits and demerits again really quickly. So we've got the live vein entering the soil, we've got interest in the live vein all the way to the top of the tree, we've got the foliage here that could be flipped forward. Now on the demerit side of that, we've got less interest up here, we've got the straight gin on this side. So now let's flip the tree around to the opposite side and see what we have available to use. Maybe this side might be a better option. So if you take a look here, obviously we've got a lot of interest on this side as well. A lot of that interest though is actually covered up by the foliage. So beneath all of this growth down here, there's a lot of movement. There are features called edajin beneath the surface there as well. What those are live branches with deadwood kind of intertwined along the length of the branch. So essentially it's like a shari on a live branch. So those features are relatively rare on junipers, so if you come across those, you always want to try to incorporate those into the design if possible. And since we do have that in this area here, if I move this away, you can see a little bit of that feature right through this area. So we can build the foliage around this to show that off as a feature. It would draw your eye right to that. So that's definitely one nice merit from this side of the tree. Now, if you look up at the top of the tree, we've got fantastic movement up through this area. The line of the deadwood right through here is great. This motion right through here is also fantastic. You lose that visual from the other side. But on the demerit side here, we don't really have much of a visual of the live vein actually entering the soil. You can sort of see it coming right down here and touching on both sides, but you get a much better visual from the original front. So that's one demerit from this side. Now, if you look over here at this foliage, this is really technically actually a separate tree from that one there. It's connected probably by the roots down below, but you could easily separate this as a separate plant. So we're not 100% sure if we're going to be using this in the design, but it may be a good counterbalance to all of the foliage on the opposite side of the tree. So regardless of which side we end up using as the front, for now, we may keep this, we may get rid of it, we're not 100% sure quite. So one last thing on this side too that I would consider a merit, a positive, is all of this deadwood down here at the base. So all of these sort of wispy gins, these were originally roots of the tree. Now this tree is technically what we would call a neagari or exposed root style tree. Even though we really only have one live root here and all of these are dead, it still would be considered a neagari. So the fact that we can see the remnants of the history of the tree in those dead roots, I think is really, really cool. And then of course, there are a lot of interesting little deadwood features down below here too. So for me personally, I prefer this side of the tree because I can actually see all of those features when I pull that foliage away, which you guys can't really see quite yet. So I think we're going to end up going with this side as the front of the tree, even though both sides could make a nice bonsai. All right, so now we can start talking about actually choosing and selecting branches and then how we're actually going to place those branches. So quite obviously the tree is moving to the left. So we're going to have our directional branch or branches somewhere down in this area here. But moving back up into the tree, where's the apex going to go? Now, traditionally, what I would normally do is build an apex kind of right in this area. That gives you a really nice sense of balance within the tree. Typically, when you're designing a plant like this, we bring the apex a little bit closer to over the base of the tree, and that'll give you that nice balance. But this tree is extremely weird with all of its features, so I don't necessarily want to treat it as a traditional design, building, your typical scalene triangle with the foliage. I think we should do something a little bit different. So rather than using this as the apex in this area, what I'm thinking is we may either remove this completely or somehow manipulate it to the back to give us some depth back here. And in doing so, we'll end up with this foliage as the potential apex. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that we have the edajin right here. So drawing your eye to that as part of the apex could also add a lot of interest in that area too. But I just like the idea of having this sort of hunched over look to the tree. And I actually think it's going to add a lot of directionality to the plant to eliminate this and have that apex sitting further out. Now, another thing that we're considering is building multiple apexes on this tree. So we've got our main one here. We're thinking maybe about having a secondary apex somewhere out in this area, perhaps manipulating that branch into position to again draw your eye even further out in that direction, forcing the movement to the left. And then we're thinking about adding a third apex to this tree with this foliage over here. So this foliage over here is going to give us that needed balance since we're manipulating everything so far off to the left side of the tree. To have this counterbalance weight over here, I think is actually going to visually balance the tree just a little bit better. But The key here is going to be to make sure that this isn't too far out, because what we don't want is for the tree to look like it's stretched out, like it's got its arm stretched out going opposite directions. We still want to pull this side in a little bit so you have that directionality there moving to the left. So your eye moves with the intended directionality of the tree. So we're going to get in there, wire everything up first, and then start to manipulate the branches, setting our directional branch first and then working our way back up towards the top. All right, so on the left side of the tree here, I'm going to spin this around, you can see. So this branch right here is just a little bit too heavy. We actually have a much softer branch emanating from the same larger branch but closer to the trunk. So when you run into situations like this, rather than trying to manipulate this heavy branch into place, if you can cut back to softer growth and manipulate that around, it's going to be much easier to get a nice soft design and get that movement in the branches to mimic the rest of the trunk. All right, so we've started to set the branches here from the bottom. As you can see, we've got a nice padded look so far. Now we're not overly refining the tree at this stage because it's relatively sparse, still a little bit weak on this side as well. So I want to leave a majority of the foliage, so I'm not really refining the undersides of the pads necessarily too much, but I am trying to delineate those pads so we can at least see the basic structure here. So now we're going to move up into the apex here, but I feel that it's kind of falling a little bit too far forward and off to the side here, so we're going to apply a guy wire to pull this back up just a little bit so that it doesn't overhang our lower branches too much.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
shit. Okay. No. All right. Okay, so as you can see, we've finished wiring and placing all of the branches. Now, we wanted to go with kind of a unique look for this tree like we talked about earlier. So we did build our apex here, pulled that back up and in here. We ended up not building that longer apex out to the side here. It just didn't fit with the overall design. But I am glad that we cut off the initial apex that we had back here. I think moving this over in this area and framing all of the interesting edagin that we talked about earlier, I think that was probably the best choice for that area. Now this little tree over here, we manipulated back and forth to figure out exactly what would look the best. The initial placement of the branches made it look a little bit too much like its own little perfect bonsai over here. It didn't really flow with what we had on the left side. So I reorganized the apex, brought it up and over to kind of flow in the same direction as our main tree over here. Now, technically, I think normally what would be done with this tree is this would be removed from the plant. We would be left with just this and the interesting deadwood. But it's such a unique, weird tree, we figured we might as well embrace the full weirdness of the tree. So we did decide to keep this. Now the only issue is that down here, the base of this tree is quite straight. So maybe in the future, we'll add a little bit of shari to make it tie in a bit better with the rest of the tree. But overall, I think it looks pretty interesting. And we decided to name this tree after a Harry Potter character because I'm a total nerd. So we named this the Dementor. So for those of you who don't know what that is, go Google it. But the tree looks exactly like a Dementor, I think. Is that good?
Yeah.
All right.